Began this morning with the Herdman family, and particularly how they help us see that sin's influence is universal, that all of us have sinned. And in fact, it's not pointing the finger at others and saying, look at them, they're the problem. But it's really looking in the mirror and realizing that I am the problem, that all of us are touched by the influence of sin. But in the verses that follow, there in verses 13 through 18, Paul goes on to string together a few more quotations from Old Testament books to drive home the point not only that its scope is universal, but its extent is pervasive. He talks about the extent of sin's influence, and he wants people to understand that it touches on every facet of their life. What they think, what they do, what they say, how they act, how they live, all facets of life are touched by the influence of sin. Notice what he says there. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. What we say is influenced by sinfulness. He goes on to say their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. He talks about our actions, the things that we do, and the violence that is entailed therein. And then he goes on and he just kind of wraps it all up in verse 18 by saying there is no fear of God before their eyes. No fear of God before their eyes. Sin's influence is pervasive. And no matter, it touches every facet of our thinking, of our will, of our life, of what we say. Every facet of who we are is touched by the influence of sin. It's interesting that to discover, it was for me anyway, that for some reason humans can't walk in a straight line. There's just something about our inner orientation that causes us to walk in a crooked or a warped sort of way. It makes, for me, a perfect metaphor for the influence of sinfulness in our lives. That was the conclusion, you see, of Robert Krulwich, who is the science correspondent for NPR. And in an interview with Steve Inskeep on Morning Edition recently, Krulwich cited a study from a German scientist who had blindfolded his subjects and then asked them to walk for an hour in a straight line. Without exception, no one could do it. Of course, everybody thinks that they're walking in a straight line until their blindfolds are removed and they see the path that they actually took. Krulwich observed that this tendency has actually been studied now for at least a century. He said they animated tests from the 1920s so you could literally see what happens to men who are blindfolded and told to walk across a field in a straight line or swim across a lake in a straight line, and they simply couldn't. He said you see them going in these strange loop-de-loops in either direction. There is, he concludes, a profound inability in humans to walk straight. For me, that's a perfect metaphor for the influence of sin in our lives. That no matter what we seek to do, the influence of sin causes it to be a bit off kilter, off of what God's intent for us is, what His will is. And so no matter how great our intentions, the influence of sin in our lives touches every facet of that life, so that in the end, instead of walking the straight and narrow, we end up taking a detour and getting off the path that God would have for us. Now, it would be easy to conclude in a time like this that that's kind of a bit of a downer for the Christmas season. Or is it? Is it possible that our awareness of our sinfulness is actually a very important insight? And obviously, that's where I'm headed. I believe that our understanding of the meaning of Christmas is greatly illumined by the fact that we can grasp that it was our sinfulness in the first place that led to the coming of Jesus. That Christmas is about Christ coming to do something about that very problem in our lives. He did it for everyone, and He did it to fix or to address the problem. You see, once we grasp this insight that all have sinned and that sin's influence in our lives is pervasive, then it enables us to know the experience of forgiveness of sin. It enables us to be freed of that. That truth is essential to receiving the transforming grace of Jesus Christ in our lives. Unless I recognize the need in my life, I can't know the remedy. For you see, back in Romans 3:23, which we read from a moment ago, if you look at that short verse in context, you discover that it's for that reason that Christ came in the first place. We read there beginning at verse 22, this righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. You see, Jesus came precisely because all have sinned. He came for all because all of them needed the transforming and forgiving grace that He could bring. And when we recognize that, we're enabled to receive His forgiveness and know release from that guilt of sin in our lives, to know release from the power of that sin to guide our actions in life. And all of that lies at the heart of Christmas. If we go back to Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, Joseph is receiving word from the angel there that he should stay with Mary, and that the birth of their child is going to make a difference in human history. The angel says to Joseph there in verse 21, she will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. You see, their sins lies at the heart of why it is that Jesus came in the first place. When we recognize our own sinfulness, then we're open to the solution that Christ can bring to our lives, the freedom of forgiveness and freedom from the power of sin in our lives. Now, the other thing that this insight does is that it prevents us from playing the comparison game. Because our tendency, I would argue, precisely because of the pervasive influence of sin in our lives, our tendency is to always look for others, to readily notice the sinfulness in others without recognizing the sinfulness in ourselves, without recognizing that I too am like that. It's easy for the children in that church in the best Christmas pageant ever to point at the herdman kids because they're the ones who are sinful, but then not in the end to recognize their own sinfulness and their need of the transforming grace of Christ. And we catch a little bit of that story in a parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. In fact, Luke tells us there that Jesus told it precisely to address that problem, that comparison game problem in the lives of others. He says there, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. So what's the parable? Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, revealing words there. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus lays out the question for his audience. Who do you think went home justified before God? Now, the reason Jesus tells the story is because most of those in his audience would have thought for sure the Pharisee. But Jesus stuns them in that last verse. I tell you the truth, verse 14. I tell you the truth, this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Very easy to point to the other person and to think of how righteous I am, when Jesus says in reality, don't play that game, because your life too is justified, or is marked by the influence and the pervasive influence of sin. Don't be pointing at the other person and trusting your own righteousness. Recognize your need. Don't be pointing at the herdmans when your own life and heart is also touched by sin. And one of the interesting things for me about the Christmas story is just how much it is filled with reminders that Jesus came for all people and not just for certain ones. That Jesus came to make a difference in the lives of all. For example, the angelic announcement of Christ's birth is given to shepherds. Now, the familiarity of the Christmas story to all of us keeps us from recognizing just how intriguing that fact really is. For shepherds in this day, at least in the eyes of the larger population, were a bit uncouth. They were rough around the edges. They were just plain, in some cases, bad people. They were not the people that the good folks hung out with. And yet it was to them that the announcement of the birth of Christ came. I believe that's no accident. They were the poor, the mischievous, the trouble causers, the rabble-rousers, and they were precisely the ones to whom God gave his announcement about the birth of Jesus. In addition to that, in the Christmas story, we have the Magi showing up in Jerusalem, looking for the one who had been born King of the Jews. They were from the East, they were outsiders, and in the eyes of good Jewish people, they were Gentiles. And yet Jesus came for them as well. They were looking to find Jesus and to worship him, to be present at the scene of his arrival, for Jesus came for them as well. Jesus came for them, he came for the shepherds, he came for the herdmen, and yet he came for you, because your life was in need of that as well. Oh, that we can grasp that vital truth. In his book, Being the Body, Charles Colson writes about meeting a businessman whom he calls in the book Mr. Abercrombie. You see, Mr. Abercrombie had invited Colson to speak at a Bible study that he hosted with 19 other movers and shakers in the business world. Colson writes about what transpired in that meeting. He said that Mr. Abercrombie had asked me to speak at the luncheon and then allow time for questions. He said, somewhere in my talk I referred to our sinful nature. He said, actually, total depravity was the phrase that I used, but I noticed at the time that a few of the folks there shifted uncomfortably in their fine leather chairs. And sure enough, it must have hit its mark, because after I finished, Colson said, the first question was on sin. You don't really believe we are sinners, do you? The old gentleman said. I mean, you're too sophisticated to be one of those hellfire and brimstone fellows. Intelligent people don't go for that backcountry preacher stuff. Colson said, I replied, well, yes, sir, I do believe that. I believe we are desperately sinful. What's inside each of us is really pretty ugly. In fact, we deserve hell, and we would get it but for the sacrifice of Christ for our sins. Colson said that at that point, Mr. Abercrombie himself looked distressed. His response, well, I don't know about that. I'm a good person and have been all my life. I go to church and I get exhausted spending all my time doing good works. Colson said at that point, the room became particularly quiet, and 20 pairs of eyes were trained directly on him. This is what he said. If you believe that, Mr. Abercrombie, and I hate to say this, for you certainly won't invite me back, but if you believe that, you are, for all your good works, farther away from the kingdom than the people I work with in prison, who are aware of their own sins. He said at that point, someone at the other end of the table coughed. Another man rattled his coffee cup, and he said a flush began to quickly work its way up from beneath Mr. Abercrombie's starched white collar. And then, he says, I added one of my favorite R.C. Sproul shockers. In fact, gentlemen, if you think about it, we are all really more like Adolf Hitler than like Jesus Christ. He said if you thought it was quiet in the room before that, there was now a stony silence until someone finally eased the pain and changed the subject. When the lunch ended and Colson was preparing to leave, Mr. Abercrombie stopped him, took his arm, and he said, didn't you say you wanted to make a phone call when we were finished? Colson says, I started to say that wasn't necessary, but then he realized that Mr. Abercrombie wanted to speak with him in private. Yes, thank you, I said. He led me down the corridor to an empty office, he said, and as soon as we were inside, Mr. Abercrombie said to him bluntly, I don't have what you have. No, you're right. You're right, Colson replied, but you can. And I believe God is touching your heart right now. No, he said. Mr. Abercrombie took a step back. Maybe sometime. But Colson said, I pressed a bit more. And moments later, we were both on our knees. And Mr. Abercrombie asked forgiveness of his sins and turned his life over to Christ. Poulson's conclusion: Martin Luther was right. The ultimate proof of the sinner is that he doesn't know his own sin. Our job sometimes is to help him to see it. The Herdmans, Paul's writings in Romans chapter 3, and Jesus coming all help us to see, frankly, the desperate depravity of our sin. Not so that we might be depressed and discouraged, but so that we may know its remedy, so that we may know its forgiveness. But only if we are willing to see.